Okay, Caroline, does that look good? Great. Okay, well, as I said, it is a true pleasure to be here with you all today. We are very excited about kicking off this best practice series. My name is Emma Cardelli. I'm a clinical psychologist and research associate at the center. I'm going to pass it over to my colleague, Vanya, to introduce herself.
Sure. Good morning, good afternoon, depending where you're coming from. My name is Vanya Page, and I'm also a staff psychologist here at the center at Boston Children's Hospital.
Now, we have one other colleague who's going to be presenting with us today, but is still, I think, experienced.
I'm here.
Oh, Osa, perfect, fantastic. What beautiful timing. Can you introduce yourself?
Good. Yes, hello everyone. My name is Asab Isa. I am a social worker and a program coordinator for here at our center. And thank you all for taking the time to join us today. And I will pass back to you, Emma.
Great. Okay. All right. So I'm going to dive right into it then. Dr. Ellis, who started us off today, already gave you guys kind of a broad overview of what it is we do at the center and how we operate. I'm going to speak in a little bit more depth to that before diving into the meat of our content today. So at the Trauma and Community Resilience Center, we develop both prevention programming and clinical interventions to meet the multifaceted needs of refugees and immigrant children and their families, in addition to other trauma-affected populations. We then do work to disseminate those interventions on both a national and global level, providing technical assistance through training and consultation to human service providers and agencies. We also conduct basic science and community-based research in order to better understand factors contributing to risk and resilience trajectories, in addition to research focused on evaluating the effectiveness of the various interventions and programs we develop. And finally, in partnership with researchers, practitioners, policymakers, and refugee communities, we develop resources to enhance the capacity of various service sectors to meet the unique needs of refugees in resettlement, to ensure that schools, medical facilities, mental health clinics, courts, etc., are all more aware of the migration experience, how this experience can impact health, well-being, and identity, and the unique strengths and stressors impacting families in resettlement. If you're interested in learning more about our work, please refer to our website, to the Boston Children's Hospital webpage for more information. We can put that website in the chat later today. Okay, so our agenda for today. Here are the topics that we're hoping to cover. We are going to be talking about the migration experience, understanding trauma in the context of the immigrant and refugee experience. We'll be talking a little bit about the intersection of trauma and culture, understanding traumatic stress through a culturally responsive lens, and then integrating cultural humility into clinical practice, where we'll be emphasizing strategies for doing so. All right, so in the chat, briefly, I know everybody's introduced themselves, which is great. We'd also just like to hear a little bit about a little like snippet about your specific role within your agency, just a tiny little snippet, and what you hope to take away from today's webinar. So I'm going to pause here for about 2 or 3 minutes just to let people populate that in the chat. Great, I'm seeing some responses coming through. Awesome. Better knowledge base and resources for families that you're all serving. This is great. Okay, keep it coming. I am now going to pass it to Vanya to start us off.
All right. Thank you, Emma. I love reading these in the chat. It sounds like we have such a diverse audience today. So as Emma shared, today's focus is really centering our work around immigrant refugee populations. So to start this work, we feel it's important to kind of orient ourselves to some definition and context of the communities we serve and work with. Starting with definition of refugees. So refugee is a person who's been forced to flee their country due to war, persecution, and violence, often as it relates to race, religion, nationality, and social group. And then the next definition that we focused on is an asylum seeker who often has been forced to flee for similar reasons due to race, religion, nationality, or social group. But the big difference is they're formally applying for legal and physical protection in their resettlement country, versus for refugees, they're applying for this process usually during their internal displacement process or in their process of migration. And then the third definition that we would like to talk about is unaccompanied children or minors, who I'm imagining many of you worked with thus far. And these are considered children under the age of 18 who have been separated from both parents or caregivers, and are often then, upon resettlement, in the custody of foster care or other social service systems in their resettlement country. The following definition, it focuses on undocumented immigrants. These are individuals who simply don't have the legal documentation and authorization to be within their resettlement country. And then the final definition, which in some ways I think encompasses all of these in many levels, and it's used interchangeably, is immigrants, who is someone who's voluntarily leaves their country to make a new life in another country. And the reason we like to talk about and start with definitions is that these definitions have a great impact on resources and supports that are available to individuals based on their legal status. So Emma, if you can just go to the next slide. So for example, depending on your entry and arrival and legal status, one may have access to federal public benefits. So refugees, because they're arriving with these protections, do have access to federal public benefits, which can impact social service access, educational opportunities, and even employment. Compared to, if we think about asylee seeker, often cannot work in their country of resettlement and does not have the same degree of supports. Similarly, if we think about unaccompanied minors, often lack tremendous degree of social support because they're coming here on their own. And even though they can be part of foster care systems and bigger social service system, they often lack community, family, and other supports. So it's really important to think about, these definitions, not just as solely as a definition, but what implications does that have for individuals to access services? What understanding do they have of those services, and how can they receive them? Okay, so now we're going to orient ourselves a little bit to some numbers and context of why is this work important. So we're going to start by looking at, and go ahead, Emma. Currently, and we've seen this in really the last 5 years, we are coining this term of global displacement crisis. As of 2020, 82.4 million people are forcibly displaced worldwide, meaning that they've been forced to flee due to violence, instability in their home country, weather challenges they've experienced, and natural and disasters. And we're realizing that out of those 82.4 million, Emma, if you can go to the next one, 26.4 million are considered refugees. And within those 26.4 million, half are under the age of 18. So the implications, if we think about long-term impact, are tremendous. And I'll let you can pull up the last two. And what's really important to also remember within this context and these numbers, that out of those 26.4 million, only about 1% will be able to receive legal protections to resettle in another country, such as the United States. And then this last statistic here is, over since 1975, US has resettled over 3 million refugees. And these numbers have really drastically vacillated, from 11,000 to we've seen 80 to 90,000 refugees enter US each year. And these numbers are really dependent on government relations, political agendas and mandates, and really fluctuate from year to year. But as we can see here in 2021, we've seen quite a drop in refugees entering, which is down to 11,814. Okay. And beyond the kind of global numbers, we're also seeing tremendous changes in our classrooms and young people that we work with. So we know that immigrants and refugees are some of the fastest growing portion of the US population. If we look at statistics from 1995, 2014, first and second generation immigrant children have grown by 51%. That is 18.7 million children, and 10% or 4.7 million students attending public schools are English language learners, which is just reflective of how many people signed up even for this webinar today. So there's a tremendous need and for discussion and intervention supports for this population. So if we think about how to conceptualize and understand immigrant refugee population, but more importantly, immigrant refugee migration experience, often we've turned to Europe Rothenberg's work of social ecology model and thinking about how we have this young person in the middle looking at the individual, but that individual does not come to this country in silo, but often is impacted by all of these ecologies and systems around them. So really thinking about their family, their community, their peer group, neighborhood, and culture. And I like to think about this kind of as a web that all of these systems are interacting and impacting each other. And by simply pulling on one, all the other systems are also impacted. So when we think about the migration experiences of immigrant refugees, we like to think about it in 3 tiers. We like to think about their pre-migration experience and their journeys in life that they've experienced in their home country, their migration journey, so what that journey has looked like from the minute that they left their home country. For some, that may be 2 weeks. For others, it can be months or years spent in refugee camps. And then we close out by thinking about their post-migration, so life in their resettlement country. So Emma, you can go next slide. So if we think about pre-migration and migration stressors, I'm sure many of you have seen this in your own work. For starters, many young people, children and young people and families that experience high degrees of separation from their families, death of loved ones, have experienced high degree of poverty, hunger, and exhaustion. It's not uncommon for young people to experience violence, imprisonment, rape, torture, because as we said, many are fleeing due to danger of persecution. And many have lost trust in political systems and social structures because often they've been harmed by those systems. Many have lost their homes, lost their home countries and have to flee their home countries, often not because they wanted to, but because they had no choice. And through this process, right, if you are forced to flee because of your religious, cultural, and social background, their identity and core beliefs may be targeted through this process. So as I've said, many of these experiences are lived in their home countries, but then as you can imagine, that migration journey and what that migration journey looks like. For some, it's, going by foot. If we think about some things that are happening, what, young people are experiencing coming from Central America, others are living in refugee camps. If we think about history of Somalia or Burma and Myanmar in the last 20, 30 years, where generations of children and families have grown up in refugee camps. So all of these experiences are then, there's a process of re-traumatization that happens from migration to the phase of migration itself. And then we can go next slide. So upon resettlement, so we think about this resettlement as the kind of last phase. Some of the new trauma insults, as we like to call them, is the continuation of family separation and loss. Many individuals are coming here either with 1 or 2 family members or no family members at all. Individuals may experience community violence and are coming maybe into neighborhoods that they have not experienced before. Discrimination, depending on their own cultural identity, racial and ethnic identities, and high degree of poverty. And through all of these, we see that immigrant refugee experience these what we call core stressors. So stressors are resettlement, meeting basic needs, housing, navigating healthcare, to acculturation stressors. So balancing now new life, new language, changes in family roles and structures. They're also experiencing history of trauma, as we've shared. And then finally, isolation. Many have been ripped apart from communities and their family members, and are now in new places where they may not have access to those family members and communities. So then how do we think about context of trauma and defining trauma? As I saw in the chat, I don't think these definitions are probably unfamiliar to many of you, but we start by thinking of trauma as a Greek word for wound. Trauma is used to describe experiences, situations that are emotionally and psychologically painful, but more importantly, overwhelm people's ability to cope, leaving them powerless. We know that trauma is a biochemical response to a stressful situation, meaning that there is a neurobiological response as a way to protect oneself in the face of danger. We know that trauma is both discrete and complex, and for many immigrant refugee populations, we see that much of traumatic experiences are actually complex and have happened, as we've said, across multiple phases of their migration journey. We also know that trauma really depletes and overwhelms one's resources and protective factors. So for example, if we think about a newly arrived family that came to Boston, let's say, without appropriate social support, there's a depletion of resources that may help them meet the needs of their new community. We also know that trauma is unique to each person, and just because many immigrants or refugees do experience these horrific traumatic stressors does not mean that they will all develop PTSD. In fact, many do not. We also know that trauma is rooted in personal, social, political contexts, and they all intersect. And as we've said, if you think about pre-migration, why individuals are forced to flee, so much of that is really to political and social context. And the trauma is never a weakness or a personal failing, but something that has been brought on to a person. And the trauma experience is both subjective, so meaning, defined by the individual, but also developmentally and culturally bound and rooted, as we'll talk today. So what are some signs of traumatic stress that we see often with children and young people? Well, first, we do see potential for post-traumatic stress disorder. So often high degree of psychological arousal, re-experiencing traumatic events, avoidance of certain memories that they've experienced, as well as negative cognition and mood. We see signs and symptoms of depression. In school, we may see changes in behavior, but also behavior problems, especially externalizing problems, but also internalizing. We can see changes in learning and concentration problems that sometimes, can impact executive functioning, ability to problem solve and learn. And this is especially true if we think about schools and cognitive loading that requires to come into a new place, learn a language and learn. We see challenges with emotion regulation and trouble with relationships. If you experience history of trauma and you've learned that the world is a dangerous place, it may be hard to develop trusting new relationship and feel safe with other people. And then we also see a lot of somatic symptoms, specifically headaches, stomach aches. We can see trouble with sleeping and nightmares as well. Go ahead, Emma. So as we kind of transition to talking about what is trauma, it's really important to remind ourselves that definitions of trauma have changed across time and are essentially rooted really in social, cultural, and political context, even here in the United States. Early definitions, start in 1885 with Freud, deeming the word hysteria when he first started treating women with history of sexual abuse. But from there, then we see 1915, beginning of conversations of looking at soldiers from World War I, World War II, and realizing, this idea of shell shock that they were experiencing, and often blaming the soldiers, and in Freud's case, blaming the women for, that there's something wrong with this person. They're not apt to meet the challenges of stressors that they're experiencing. However, in 1970s, we see a shift during the Vietnam War and this push against the anti-war, as well as women's rights movements. we see the beginning of merging of communities and psychologists realizing that, oh, there's similarities with what women are reporting post rape and sexual abuse, as well as what these young soldiers are experiencing post Vietnam War. And it's not until 1980s that we have the first definition of PTSD in the DSM. So really, our history of trauma is pretty recent. Followed by 1980, it's not until 1985 that Dr. Maria Yellowhorn Braveheart coins the term historical trauma when working with indigenous communities. And following that, we follow Judith Herman's seminal work of looking at intersection of trauma and political and social context. In 2007, that follows conversation about race-based trauma, slave-based trauma, as well as really beginning in the 2000 plus, looking at how the trauma impacts the body. So I say all this is because you can see as our definitions as providers have changed, that has also impacted the communities we serve and how we define and understand symptoms and presentations. So when we think about what is culture, this whole training and talk can be about what is culture, but really we like to root it in lived and inherited social and behavioral norms, beliefs, and customs of a group of people. There are often patterns that are both explicit and implicit for different groups, and that often culture consists of historical derived and selected ideas and their attached values. It's a way of living and dying for different communities. And it's really integrated pattern of human behavior that includes our thoughts, communications, actions, customs, beliefs, and it's all encompassing. And most importantly, really, culture is really a combination of our values and behavior. So as clinicians, it's important to think about how culture impacts not only trauma symptomatology, but also how individuals seek help. Different cultures exhibit and explain symptoms in various ways, which we'll talk about today, and also make meaning very differently out of adversity in different ways. So for a whole community to experience war, they may experience and understand that definition very differently compared to one individual who's experienced one discrete traumatic event. And through all of this, we have to consider how mental health stigma and language barriers also impact engagement and understanding of mental health services. And I'll turn it over now to Osab and Emma.
Thank you, Vanya. So in addition to the way culture can impact symptom presentation and clinical formulation of need, it's also important to consider how culture can impact the patient or client-provider interaction in and of itself. What you see here is a comparison between cultural expectations and values in interdependent cultures with cultural expectations and values in cultures that promote independence, as is typical in the United States. So to highlight a few examples of this, in the United States, mental health providers are often taught to set and uphold clear and rigid boundaries with clientele in order to be transparent about the bounds of the relationship, that it's not necessarily a helper's role to help with everything whenever any needs arise, and of course also to prevent burnout. Osab, perhaps you could speak to how this approach might contrast with what's common in interdependent cultures?
Sure. For the interdependent cultures, help is given when asked. So what does that mean? So let's say if I need help right now, I would walk into a local agency, a local community center, or a mosque. It depends on what my needs are. And then the help is there. And then they know to also help me and not turn me away, even if that's outside of their role.
Another example is the way in which kind of distance is often viewed, distance or personal space is often viewed as professional. So when you create physical distance between yourself and your clients, let's say, it's often seen as professional in the United States and further helps to reinforce a boundary between patient and provider.
Yeah.
Please. Yeah.
And I think interdependent cultures, again, is a closed personal space, is rapport building. I think particularly when you're working with refugee and immigrant population, we have lost everything. As an immigrant woman, we have lost everything. So only thing really we have is connection with other people. So I think it is so important, and I will say the centers of everything of kind of keep that connection and relationship very close as much as possible. So I think sometimes we know with the clinical training, like Emma said, there can be barriers to that. So I think maybe verbalizing that depends on your relationship with your clients or that you're working with.
Thanks, Osam. And then finally, I want to talk about the concept of time, because as you all well know, in the United States, I would say particularly in more industrial or urban environments too, efficiency is prioritized. So schedules are set accordingly, and the concept of time is such that individuals are expected to arrive at the exact time an activity is expected to begin, right? So lateness rarely equals elongation of an activity. It just means that the individual who is late not only has less access to an activity, but is also expected, quite frankly, to catch up on what they missed as well. Osab, maybe you can speak to how this differs?
Sure. Again, I think time is viewed as something flexible that if today, let's say I miss my appointment with my provider, there is this, I would say, cultural understanding, at least when working with refugees and immigrant population, that at least in Arabic, we say, inshallah, tomorrow will come. So if I miss today, there will be another chance for tomorrow. Or that if I can't see my direct providers, that I'll be able to see someone else from that facility or from the clinic or wherever they have the appointment. But really that time is seen as like, we're working with humans, that there should be this understanding of just flexibility. Back to you, Emma.
Thanks, Osab. So when practicing culturally responsive care, two philosophical approaches are often upheld. Neither approach is per se better than the other. Both are typically necessary in order to deliver mental health services in a culturally responsive manner. Cultural competence is more, I would say, performative in certain ways, in that it requires that a provider become knowledgeable and even expert when possible in another's culture, so that that practitioner knows what to say and do in accordance with cultural norms, values, and expectations. In contrast, cultural humility actually speaks more to the process required to work effectively with individuals who have a different cultural background than that of the provider. Cultural humility requires self-reflection and acknowledgement of lifelong learning, with a focus on strengthening relationships and dismantling oppression. Specifically, the core tenets of cultural humility are as follows. So a commitment to self-evaluation and self-critique, recognizing, acknowledging, and changing power imbalances that are inherent in relationships, just like, for example, the provider and the client relationship, and developing mutually beneficial partnerships with communities so that we're working towards institutional accountability. Now, cultural competence is often integrated into training programs for mental health providers. However, at TCRC, our center, we find that cultural humility is far less commonly known. Unfortunately, we don't have time to provide a full-blown training today on cultural humility. However, we will be sure to include in the chat a link to a video describing the tenets and kind of core practice of cultural humility in a great deal more depth, as explained by the developers of this approach themselves, who are Melanie Tervalone and Jan Moret Garcia. Okay, so many years ago, to better understand kind of the unique needs of refugee populations in New England, we had conducted research to understand, where are the people we're hoping to serve going? Are they receiving services at all? And if so, what types of services? What we ended up ultimately finding here is that when services aren't necessarily delivered in a way that's truly culturally responsive, and the reality is our traditional healthcare system doesn't necessarily deliver services in a manner that is culturally responsive and that truly upholds both cultural competence and cultural humility, as I was talking about before. So we ended up learning from our research that among Somali refugee youth living in the New England area, of those with full criteria for PTSD, which was about a third of our sample of around 100, only 8% received services of any kind, any mental health service. And that could mean quite literally showing up once for an appointment with a psychiatrist or with a social worker. That's it. So if they're in need and they are not actually engaging with traditional healthcare institutions, where are they going to seek help? So we wanted to better understand through focus groups and our quantitative research, pathways to healing. If you're not engaging in these traditional pathways to healing that are common in the United States, where are you going? We ended up finding out that for a lot of these youth, one pathway was ultimately through community talk, where various members of a refugee community would then be informing the parents of a particular issue that they were observing in a youth. That family might try to either solve problems within the family, talk perhaps to a religious or faith-based leader, and then make a decision around whether or not to either send a child back to a country of origin, or finally to go to a mental health professional if absolutely needed. Now, I want to be clear that both of those options are not reached easily. Like this is when situations are fairly dire. You're not able to get the supports you need through religious or traditional healers, and you're trying to the best of your ability to solve problems within your family system. What this means is that you only go to a mental health provider if you absolutely cannot think of any other solution and you feel as though you've tried everything else. And the equivalent of going to a mental health provider, if you're ready to make that choice, you're also potentially ready to send your child back to his or her country of ethnic origin. That is not done to punish or reprimand a child, but there's a belief that perhaps in the United States that context isn't helping the child get the supports he or she needs, isn't helping the child fully understand or appreciate various resources that child has in the United States. And it's really done as a way to, again, kind of last resort, solve a problem when it feels like no other options are available, because for better or for worse, it seems like this child is not succeeding in the American context. In our conversations with youth, we often found out about individual coping, either by kind of communicating to a friend a need if you're struggling, or trying to solve by yourself, hiding your problems. When friends are informed and you're willing more to express what's going on, or you feel you have the skill sets to communicate what's going on, in those instances, school teachers or school counselors would find out before a mental health professional, let's say again, is utilized in a healthcare institution. So what are the barriers to mental health service engagement, right? We know that there's mental health needs. We know that people aren't open to or comfortable with, for all kinds of good reasons, engaging with traditional healthcare institutions, again, in the United States context. So in our research and clinical work, we've discovered that there are really 4 key barriers to mental health service engagement. There's the primacy of resettlement stress, distrust of authority and power, stigma around mental illness, and language and cultural barriers, of course, that inhibit access. So when we think about the primacy of resettlement stressors, what is it that we're talking about? Well, for families, for example, focusing on depressive symptoms when somebody needs stable housing might seem ridiculous. There's a pressing need when we think about Maslow's hierarchy of need and how basic needs must be met before we address perhaps psychiatric needs. things like food, housing, finances, basic needs need to take priority over mental health needs. And when you're talking about refugees being resettled in a context where they often have to survive and thrive fairly quickly. I mean, typically the length of resettlement support is around 3 months right away. And then if you're lucky, some level of extension to that, but that's it. By the time you hit 3 months, you're in many ways supposed to have your kids engaged in the American school system. You're supposed to ideally be demonstrating some level of independence, that you get a job, right? That you can hold on to housing that's been afforded to you. All of these things have to happen quite fast. And in many, many instances, refugees themselves are resettled in communities that are already stressed, perhaps impoverished, lots of other stressors that exist within these communities as well. And so it's very, very hard to make a case around addressing mental health needs when these fundamental basic needs have not yet been met. In addition, when thinking about child-focused services as mental health care providers who work with children, focusing on one child may be confusing when we're talking about working oftentimes with families who are coming from collectivistic or interdependent cultures, as we were talking about before, where an entire family system has a need. How then can I solely focus on the needs of my one individual child who might be feeling sad about something or having a difficult time adjusting to American culture? But again, I still can't feed all 6 of my children. That's where my focus needs to be, not just on the mental health needs of this one particular child. Distrust of authority and power. This is another major barrier to care. A lot of times, as Vanya was talking about before, refugees and immigrants prior to enduring migration can experience major violations in trust and social contract secondary to forcible displacement and the migration experience. As a result of that, many are slow to trust due to historical abuses by those in positions of power and authority in their home countries and in their countries of migration as well. And so it can be very, very difficult to then all of a sudden cross a border into another country and say, oh, okay, I'm here. I'm in a sanctuary now. I'm somewhere safe. I can trust people. We all know, you know, as again, looking at all of your guys' fantastic clinical experience and through the chat, you all know very well trust doesn't happen instantaneously. And our prior experiences have a significant impact on trust in one's current life. And just because you cross a border into another country doesn't always mean that trust in and of itself is instantaneous. There's a lot of very understandable hesitation that we as providers need to be cognizant or aware of. Stigma of mental illness is another significant barrier to care. Having a psychological problem is seen as problematic, quite frankly, honestly, almost everywhere, including in the United States, it can be seen as problematic. What often happens in other parts of the world is that mental health is really not viewed on a continuum. It's viewed instead as kind of a dichotomy or binary. You're either crazy or you're not. That's it. So if you're working with a refugee child or family system and trying to explain to a parent, for example, that there might be a mental health need, given how mental health is viewed in other parts of the world, it might seem as if you are identifying a mental health need in my child, you are quite literally telling me that my child is crazy. And I know what happens to crazy people in my quote unquote country of origin. And that's not what's happening for my child, right? And then linguistic and cultural barriers. So even if the first 3 barriers are hurdled, I think then there's this fundamental question of, is there even a provider who speaks their language and understands their cultural context? And if not, then what? I'm going to pass it over to Osab to tell us then what.
Thank you both, Vanya and Emma. So some of the strategies for addressing these barriers mentioned above are integration of services. Next one, please, Vanya, or Emma, who's controlling. Integration of services, making referrals, and providing holistic care. For integration, trying to incorporate mental health services with other social services. And when making referral, provide a warm handoff to other service providers so that families feel like their concerns have been heard and are being addressed, especially when working with families who have a negative experience with systems. And we know this population, particularly refugee and immigrants, are often involved in the systems, are working with multiple systems at the same time. Framing, so identify ways in which mental health treatment can reduce resettlement stressors, reduce the number of times a parent gets a call from school, and then holistic care, recognize that resettlement stresses might directly be contributing to child's mental health problems, and that addressing these stressors can be part of the mental health care, can be part of the good mental health care. Next, community engagement. Next one, please. We know trust takes time, so we recommended that you accept a slow-paced, convey warm and genuine interest, and less of a transactional approach. Most medical settings, a meeting with a doctor might only be 15 minutes, and a client probably took the day off, had to take multiple transportations, train, car, maybe left her kids behind with someone to care for. And the doctor only has no more than 15 minutes to meet with the client. So I think you can only imagine that client who walks away with maybe some kind of a disappointment and wondering, was that 15 minutes even worth it for all the hassles that I went through? Clarity, I would say, state clearly what each provider can or cannot do. Provide your business contact information and availability. Some refugee families and clients are familiar with working with one provider historically. And he or she might have been probably providing almost everything that's needed at the moment. And all families, really what families most care about is, are their issues being approved or problem being resolved, right? And less about maybe our titles or credentials. And integrity, so never shy away from difficult issues, acknowledge upfront if a provider is a mandated reporter. And why is this important? I think families might not be familiar with what filing report is. So if you are noticing a problem that requires that you need to file a report for a family or like engage child protective services, I think if possible, let them know that you are gonna do this, and then what to expect. I think sometimes families come in with the fear of like, is my child going to be taken away? Is there going to be more disruption to my household? And I think as a provider, you need to let them know, if your job is only to report and Child Protective Services job is to investigate, then say that. And as much as you can, try to continue that building rapport, because we know what this can add to, right? And then follow through on promises to clients, show through actions that providers can be trusted. Next one, please. Next. And embedding services in service systems. Destigmatize mental health services by embedding them in more acceptable institutions such as schools, community centers, faith-based community agency or faith-based facilities. For example, providing mental health service at school settings, kids are coming to schools. School is considered a safe place. And also children's education is essential to the parents as well as the community. asset focus or present mental health services in a positive rather than deficit-based framing. So validate the stresses that the families are going through. Let them know that they might not be accessing all the resources that they need, and what is missing in order to improve their situation. Clarity, avoid using psychological jargon that does not translate well, and use concrete examples of how the child and a family can benefit. So if you're working with a child and you tell a mom your son or daughter is experiencing anxiety, what is that? Mom might say, well, my child has everything. I don't understand what they're worrying about, right? So educate what that means. You educate what you're observing through the story or examples. And then integrate cultural and community values that brings joy, hope, and promotes resilience. I think adding positives such as reminding maybe the families or individuals that you're working with, the times that they overcame stressors, right? I think that we know that this might not be the first challenge that they experienced. And so how have they resolved or overcome other stressors in their life in the past in order to kind of like really point out some kind of a hope or create that visual in their mind. And then finally, educate, engage, and educate a wider community, particularly maybe a local community agency that might not have access to the resource that you have, as well as community leaders. Next one, please. And finally, partnership of providers and cultural expertise. So what does that mean? Educate, learn about the cultures of the communities being served, co-learning instead of poor psychoeducation, visiting a local communities or agency, faith-based organizations, and really getting to know like who is doing the work in the community. Just a way of educating yourself and not maybe not rely on your clients to tell you what their culture is. If that makes sense. Reflecting on one's own culture and how it shapes on approach to treatment and clients. So understanding really like what is their understanding of the problem? How do they see what's going on? What have maybe their religious figures, whether it's the imam or church figure, has told them about the issues, right? And I think create a partnership or even reach out to those individuals that the families trust on understanding what the problem is in order to kind of create maybe a shared goal or a shared treatment plan. And then finally, plan for a better communication by engaging interpreters, cultural brokers, and work with them to understand the families, what the family's stressors, so what's bringing the family's illness, as well as healing. Next one, please. So you must be wondering, what is cultural brokers and how do I find one? So cultural brokering is an act of bridging, linking, mediating between groups or persons of different cultural background for the purpose of reducing conflict or producing change. I know that there's going to be a whole training that focuses about cultural brokering in the near future, so stay tuned. And what do you do when you don't have a cultural broker? Consult with ethnic community-based organizations or community leaders. There are people who really, there are people doing the work. They might not have a formal organizations or place, but find out. There are people who are really keeping the community alive and engaged. Establish more formal partnership with community-based organizations. And include really, and as well as parents. Train local community agency. If you have resources and they might not have access to those resources, so train them things like mental health issues, and maybe invite them to your workplace so they understand more about what you do, and there is that shared understanding and knowledge. Integrating culture, spirituality into mental health services, we wanted to encourage families through spiritual and healing practice. Spirituality and faith can be both a barrier and a bridge. Sometimes the clients are told the reason why they are struggling because they don't have a strong spiritual beliefs. But we also know that you can be connected to your faith, right? And still have depression or other mental health problems. Some families, some clients are comfortable with, particularly, I would say this population, immigrant populations, as well as other community of color, are comfortable expressing symptoms through their pain. Somatic expression of symptoms are acceptable. So when working with them, they often present their symptoms through physical pain, such as headache or stomach pain. So I think maybe labeling for them and understanding more about how long has the symptoms been going on, what are the other symptoms, and more creating really a space for conversation. And often faith leaders are served as mental health resource. They are trusted by the community members. And I think community members go to them for everything. From when there's engagement happen, like weddings happening, to when there's a divorce, when there's a family conflict, they know more about the issues in the community that's going on. So when possible, collaborate and reach out to them. And then finally, we wanted to acknowledge that refugees and clients exist within communities, and that when they are sitting in our offices, we have to also incorporate what are the other issues that's going on in their community. Earlier, we were talking about individualistic versus the collectivism. So what are the things that's keeping them awake at night? If there are community violence, it's hard to kind of focus on the individual that's sitting in your community, in your office. So really invite them to share about what's happening in the community and what are their external concerns. Next, please. A strategy for supporting children and families from different cultural background. Listen to children and family stories, validate their hardship, stressors, and perceptions. Don't assume all families of a certain cultures are the same. Okay? Even I myself is Somali, not all Somalis share the same values for certain things. So I think that really meeting where individuals are at and relying on their own beliefs. Respect families' own understanding of the problem and the solution. If not mental health, what is the child's family source of pain? So what are the family's main concerns really? And I think that, let's say if the solution is not one that aligns with what you're recommending, is there a place to meet in the middle? If the family think that this is maybe a possession of a person was possessed by the devil, right? How can you create a space where at least you can hear what's been said and educate now that you understand the problem, maybe the problem is the issues is about the possession and the devil, but where can we create a solution, right? And who are the players in the community, or who are the key important people that can also be part of the meeting, maybe to not convince the family a solution, but to more support them. And framing is everything. Use culturally appropriate language and concept. I think even something as simple as like if you are in a school clinician or someone that works in the school system, if you're making a phone call from the school and you tell a family member, your child is sitting with the principal, family might be concerned, well, my child's future is ruined. They will never go back to, they will never have a future. Maybe they go in a jail. But really simply say that they had threw a chair, if they threw a chair, and they're upset and they were told to sit in the office until you arrive. Next one, please. And then here are some questions to consider when working with clients who are refugee and immigrant background. What is health and mental health in their culture? How are general health issues and mental illness expressed, treated in their culture? Right. Again, I think there is not many terms that are described in mental health that are, at least in my Somali culture, I can give an example. There's not a lot of terms that describe things like anxiety or depression. What Emma was saying earlier, either you're functioning and normal or you're crazy, right? So how do you help someone create a name? I think really one of the things that we recommend is through storytellings, or through, or maybe inviting other people that they can support them add to the story that's been told. When, who, and where do people go for help for this type of the problem? Maybe it's not always a therapist. Maybe it is the imam or the church leader. What has been the family's health or mental health experience? Again, if they had any negative experience with a particular agency, or that, let's say, the only time they ever reach out for help, maybe the young male end up in jail, or the young person has been castrated. So how can we undo, maybe, or reframe things that we frame negatively? What are the expectations my family have about the services as a result? What are the child's or family's strength? We know every family and a child has a strength. So how can we name them? I know in some cultures, parents might not feel comfortable praising their children or naming strengths in front of their child, right? So how can you help them emphasize the importance of that? What are the barriers to care for this child and the families? Next. So when to refer a child or adult for additional services. Many youth adjust well over time, despite the significant adversity. Some studies suggest that symptoms diminish and recur over time. So I think one of the best ways to engage families about when getting additional services is saying, like, what are you noticing, right? Are you sleeping okay? How's your eating? How are you doing? How's your overall, like how's your overall health? How are you doing? What are the things that you were doing before that you're not doing right now? Just to give them more, like, because there's less labels, like I said, about terms and symptoms. So just to really add more to maybe expand their vocabulary, if that makes sense. And when individuals' emotional or behavior dysregulation is impact their functioning. So if an individual is not really doing their day-to-day, not participating in day-to-day functions, such as going to school, going to work, maybe participating in local activities or soccer or whatever things that they do day-to-day. And then that's also a good time to make a referral. If there's any safety concerns, and limited recovery over time. And I think also when symptoms and stressors are getting worse, that's also another time to make a referral. I will pause for a second. Vanya or Emma, anything that you wanted to add? Otherwise, this is the end of my presentation, and I'll turn to you both.
Thank you so much, Osab, Emma, and Vanya. That was a significant amount of content in a short amount of time. I invite anyone who has any questions now to put them into the chat. And thank you, Emma, for putting the video on culture of humility in there as well, if you all want to check that out. Again, while we wait for questions to roll in, just a reminder, the recording, the slides and CEUs will be sent out to you at the email where you registered in the coming days. Now that you've registered, we have your email, so you will receive invites for our upcoming sessions, the next one being Monday, February 28th on cultural responsivity. In addition, you will also see in the email, the follow-up email to this session, a link for feedback. We would really appreciate you taking a few minutes to fill that out so we can improve and make our upcoming sessions even better. Let's see, with the few minutes that we have remaining, I guess I'll kick us off with a few questions. The first of which was, again, you guys fit so much wonderful content in a short amount of time. But I would say, again, to each of you, what is the one thing that you hope folks take away from today's presentation? What is one thing that folks should keep in mind if a refugee or immigrant youth walk into my office tomorrow?
I think something that was a good takeaway is just being mindful of what their experience has been before they got to me, the things that they have possibly experienced in the transition of migrating from wherever they're migrating from to here, and to be open to that and not to just, I guess, stay in the, hey, I'm here. But what if there's a language barrier? What if there's cultural differences? What if there's religious differences? All things like that.
Thank you so much. That was excellent, Lakeisha. I think to add to that, I will say that one thing that I really hope people keep in mind as well is that, you know, we are talking about a population where, as my colleague Vanya was explaining, you know, there's a ton of potential traumatic exposures that somebody can be exposed to really across the entire migration journey. But I do want to emphasize that trauma in and of itself doesn't lead to traumatic stress, and that people go through tremendous adversity and in many ways really do quite well. So one thing that I hope people take away is not that, hey, here's the Trauma and Community Resilience Center talking about a population that everybody has mental health needs. That's not necessarily the case at all. And sometimes when you attend to things like isolation stressors, like Vanya was talking about, or the resettlement stressors that I was talking about that might impact barriers to mental health care, sometimes when you meet those, when you address those social, ecological, or environmental stressors, people really thrive and end up doing quite well and might not even need mental health intervention. So I think that's another important piece I just want to emphasize as well. Vanya and Osab, if there's anything too that you'd like to add.
I guess I would just echo that, you know, the piece around Caroline said about when somebody comes into your office, I always like to say to myself that the joys and the stressors are in the eyes of the individual that's coming into your office, and to take the time to hear their story, and take the time to learn from them, and really look at yourself not as an expert in these roles, but really somebody who is there to listen and support from the lens of the individual that's coming into your office. And then secondly, just to remind ourselves of, you know, these journeys that one experiences, as Emma said, there is resiliency just in the fact that they showed up to school or to your office, and then they keep showing up to school or your office, and to be reminded of that, what that takes. And then secondly, how incredibly humbling it is for somebody who's experienced this level of adversity to come in and trust you to share their story. So to stay humble in that, and to keep that very present in all the work that we do with refugees and immigrants.
Great. Another question that came in through the chat. How do you recommend creating relationships with youth or clients without asking personal, re-triggering questions?
I can start. I think depends of the age. I think asking them what are their hobbies, what are the activities that they enjoy participating in the communities. I think that you can ask them kind of the present and in the future of things that they see themselves participating or enjoying or will keep them occupied. We're all really maybe asking much about the previously in the past history.
Great. Another question, could you speak more about the differences in roles, limit setting, and boundaries when working with other cultures or cross-culturally?
I can also start, but I will find Emma, do you want to take? Yeah, I think, I mean, the reality is that all of us, we have such a limited time, right? Realistically, we can't do everything for our clients. And our clients, some of us want our hand-holding situation, right? Where literally we do everything for them. So I think who else within your facility or outside that can help the clients? And I think you're taking the time to slow down and explain to the patient or client that I can't do all you're asking me. Can you refer to someone else that can help? And just giving them a little more rationale. So it's not being received as or perceived as you are sending them away.
I'll just add that, you know, often I think in working with this population, your clinical role may be stretched in the sense that kind of like Osa was saying earlier about meeting these basic needs. So finding housing may be the pressing need, and that's where the work needs to happen before we can get to addressing some of their traumatic stressors. Because if we can just stabilize that piece, that actually may mitigate potential, you know, symptoms down the road. So I think really reorienting our work to what is the need of the client. But I also think I used to work a lot in home-based work, working with Iraqi populations, and drinking tea when somebody comes into your home is considered the first thing you do. So, you know, before I could get to how the family's doing and what's going on, sitting down and drinking tea with the family was culturally appropriate, humble thing to do in that role. So really reorienting ourselves to what is appropriate for that cultural community, doing some research ourselves, and making sure we follow through on those parts.
Yeah, and the last thing I just wanted to add, this might or might not relate to the question, but I think reflecting and having a conversation with the clients of like, is the relationship that you have together and the goals that you set and what brought the clients, is it working? Because I think I think going to a therapist or seeing a therapist, it's like going on a date. Not every therapist is a good match for a client. So I think empowering the clients to ask you questions, questions of like, is what we're doing working? If it's not working, I think don't be shy to say, how do we make it work? Even if that requires transferring the client to someone else that is better suited than you are. All right, Caroline, back to you.
Another great question that came in was, when families don't trust support outside their family or their community, is there any kind of practical hands-on tips to help build trust?
This is a great question. And it also kind of depends on what specific service setting you're working in as well, in terms of how you approach this. Like, Vanya, not to put you on the spot, but I would love to hear from the school context. Like, what are your thoughts about this before I kind of speak more outside of that particular context, where within the school, you do have some level of access to a child and to a family system naturally as part of working with a kid within a school versus if you're kind of more of an outside provider.
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I think first and foremost, it starts with how we describe our role and how we define our role. So if I walk into a family that is newly arrived and say, hi, my name's Dr. Vanya Page, I'm a psychologist, the chances are that family will never come back and see me, because to both OSAB's and Emma's, part of presentation, there is tremendous stigma. And often families may worry like, oh my gosh, this person may report us and or lock my child up. So from the beginning, I think introducing yourself as somebody who's there to support the family, whether it is with accessing community services, supporting the success of their child at their school, to OSAP's point, like kind of hearing from family, what is it that you need? So really realigning yourself with, I am here to support you in whatever way I can. Let me learn from you. What are some challenges you're experiencing, but also what are the strengths of the family? And then beginning to work through that versus coming in these kind of very rigid clinical titles and roles that often carry a lot of stigma and quite frankly, history of distrust, whether it's in US or abroad as well. So I feel like that's the first step.
Yeah, for sure. And to go off of that further, I mean, I think that to Vanya's point, right, in addition to framing, transparency is also really key. So it's important to be really transparent and explicit about what you do without necessarily doing so using too much, as OSAB was talking about before, clinical jargon. I mean, just explaining, here's who I am and the ways in which I can be of help without necessarily defining yourself or your role solely through clinical terminology. I think the other thing that was very clear to me in what Vanya was saying as well is not to be too overly agenda driven yourself. Mm-hmm. And unfortunately, I know I myself at Boston Children's Hospital work within a healthcare system that has a lot of agendas, is fairly agenda driven. So it can be really hard when you have to complete paperwork, when you're representing a system that has certain expectations of you as a provider, not to be agenda driven. But the reality is, if we come in working with these families and emphasize too much our own agendas rather than creating space for what would you define as your most pressing needs? How are you defining the problem? How can I be of help in supporting you with X, Y, and Z problem as you define it? It's just a very, very different way to approach a family. And I think will help with trust building over time. The piece that I was saying before that can be context specific is that sometimes when you are, for example, working within a school where you have access to a child or to a family, even if they're not necessarily explicitly seeking mental health support, you can also think about building trust or just more broadly relationship building as planting a seed and very slowly watering it over time. What can you do with each micro interaction to help signal to a family, to a child, that you care, that you're there to support with whatever needs arise? And so if you can think about it in kind of a micro way, every time I see this kid or every time I interact with this family, I'm going to be watering the seed. So over time, it blossoms into a plant. I think that'll help. And it'll also help kind of us as providers not be too agenda driven as well when we think about it as much more of a slower process. Osa, please. Look like you're gonna
the last thing I just want to make it really quick and add is that I think if you do all of the things that both Emma and Vanya have suggested, also walking away and offering them that you notice that you're stuck, right? Clients, you do everything, but there's still this much stress. So I think saying that maybe we can pass the services for now and reopen at a later time, and that you or your agency is available to them. So at least they have some time to reflect on. They probably know we're getting some signals of where the mistrust is coming from.
Mm.
Oh, sorry.
It might even, I was just going to add, I think those are great responses. I was even just going to add, which may be obvious and overly simple, but ensuring that you're pronouncing your client's name correctly and learning a few simple phrases in their language. I find even mispronouncing things and struggling with their language goes a long way to build rapport. You can have a good laugh about it. I'm going to try to sneak one more question in here. I do want to try to end on time, but one more quick question. A a number of great questions came in around unaccompanied refugee minors and helping them feel more connected to their community when they don't have family around.
I can just share one thing. In a school setting, facilitating groups has been really helpful for, and not just for individuals who identify as unaccompanied minors, but really, group of social support. So starting groups at school is a way to build community, as a way to talk about acculturation stress, resettlement, isolation trauma really has been really helpful. So really finding ways in school how you can build community. So whether it's groups, whether it's mentoring, but finding these ways to build social connection can be helpful.
And in my personal experience, I think finding mentors, both to practice English language and from the same language, finding out local grocery stores where clients can find food familiar to them, and if they wish to, where their house of worship would be. But yes, I think, again, I know you all, I want to be mindful of everyone's time. Thank our wonderful presenters today. Thank you everyone for joining us. We hope that you will join us again Monday, February 28th for our cultural responsivity, our second session of 9. And again, if you have any questions, comments, feedbacks, we welcome all of it. I can throw my email in the chat, but it should be in the invite as well. Again, thank you, everyone.
Thank you all so much.
Thank you, everyone. Have a great day.